Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being with me today. I'm excited to be here with you to celebrate Food Day on October 24th. Food Day was created to inspire people to change their diets and support better food policies in their communities. But how much do we really know about our food system? What are the challenges in feeding growing populations around the world? Today we'll have a policy discussion on global food systems in middle-income countries. We'll learn about real-world agriculture and explore possible solutions to feed people in the future. At the end of the discussion, we'll have a formal question and answer session. All right. I'll also discuss the deficits in natural resources, complexities of global food systems, and conclude with some possible food policy solutions. Next slide. Let me introduce myself. My name is Bessie DiDomenica, PhD. I have my degree in public policy. My specialties include food policy, urban agriculture, and urban farming. And I wanted to just share my research with you. I made this presentation at the Harvard Law School in March. There was a conference on food policy and land rights, and I wanted to engage with other policy decision makers from around the world. It was very exciting to listen to some of the challenges that people have in different areas of the food system. I met people from, lots of indigenous people from around the world, a lot of attorneys, a lot of social justice advocates, a lot of farmers, a lot of students, and it was really interesting to see how the breadth and depth and complexity of our food system in general. So I just wanted to share some of my research with you in that area. And moving to the next slide, I'll just talk about some food system facts. Right. This slide is a snapshot of some of the challenges in today's global food system. People are starving and unhealthy while the world's population continues to grow. By 2050, the United Nations predicted that the world's population could reach 9 billion people. Recently, I read it could even reach 11 billion people. The underlying question in this research is, how will we feed people in the future? I want to draw your attention to the numbers. As you can see, people continue to starve and struggle with access to healthy food. In our discussion, we will explore some of these challenges in relation to middle-income countries, where 50% or 365 million people live. Also, women play a very important role in farming and reducing the number of hungry people in the world by 150 million people. I will also discuss the deficit in natural resources, complexities in global food systems, and conclude with some possible food policy solutions. Let's move on to the next slide, just to briefly tell you about my methodology. My research was based on literature reviews from academic journals, books, government reports, white papers, public documents, and websites. I also interviewed researchers in homeland security, organic farming, social justice, and food policy. I spoke with attorneys who are advocates for food justice, land rights, human rights, and food policy and law. And on our next slide, we'll cover a few definitions. First of all, middle-income countries, or MICs. These countries have positive economic growth for 5 years on average. They are stable and continue to grow. GDP, or gross domestic product, measures the total value of all goods and services produced over a specific period of time. Or in other words, it represents the country's economic health. Food systems. These are a collection of food-related activities. That includes those who grow the food, different ways to grow it, where it comes from, transport, social, cultural, and food traditions, as well as food quality and access to food. Sustainable agriculture is growing food within the limits of nature, and that is primarily through organic farming, recycling natural resources, and composting. Next is food security. We have 3 definitions for food security. One of them is access to enough food for an active and healthy life. That's a definition according to the U.S. Department of Agriculture. Another definition is community security, where people can access culturally appropriate and nutritional food from a sustainable food system. And the third definition of food security is the basis for human survival. When asked, we have smallholder farms. These are any farms that are less than 5 acres, and most of these are in China and India. So let's move to the next slide and talk about why middle-income countries. We have heard of food deficits in low and high-income countries. Low-income countries have large impoverished populations and unstable economic growth when compared to high-income countries, which are generally the opposite. But middle-income countries, or MICs, have qualities of both. These countries are Brazil, China, India, Indonesia, and Mexico. They have positive economic growth and very large impoverished populations. These populations have limited economic access to land, natural resources, and opportunities to grow food. I was interested in the study to understand the role of MICs in the global food system because they have both stable economic growth and large impoverished populations. A history of stable economic growth relates to a country's economic health. For example, China has had 15 years of stable GDP. India has 5 years, and Brazil has been economically stable for more than 27 years. These countries have mixed outcomes. MICs improve the well-being of people, but at the same time, they also struggle with population growth and providing healthy food to people in need. Large populations of impoverished people. Even with a stable GDP, China, India, and Brazil have more impoverished people than any other countries in the world. China has 342 million, India has 141 million, and Brazil has 106 million people, respectively. Now, let's talk a bit more on the next slide about key MIC indicators. We'll take a few minutes to just look at this chart. These numbers tell a story about conditions in these countries. Let's look at some patterns to describe the overall conditions. Pattern number 1 is economic. The GDP is consistent for at least 5 years on average. It appears that MICs have a clear pattern of improving the well-being of people between the years 2003 and 2013. This is better than the world average of 2.7 GDP. The next pattern is people. Many people are poor and starving. Over 50% of starving people in the world live in these MICs. China and India alone have more starving people than any other MIC. But at the same time, a total of 723 million people are overweight and obese. In 2015, 363 million people are starving in these middle-income countries. Pattern number 3 is food. In MICs, people have access to food, but many are starving, overweight, and obese. This means that MICs have weak infrastructures, which are unable to provide healthy food to most people. Their staple diets likely include cheap processed foods, which contributes to conditions of starvation, overweight, obesity, and rising healthcare costs. So I thought this slide is a nice snapshot of just some of the conditions in these countries. I think it's really interesting when you look at the amount of starving populations compared to the amount of overweight and obese people. There's more obese people in some countries than there are starving populations. I just find that very interesting. But at the same time, these countries have stable economic growth. There's a real contradiction there. So sometimes you think about the economic development process is not focused on what it should be, perhaps in providing better food for people so that they can reduce not only starvation, but also obesity and overweight, which can contribute to lower healthcare costs. Okay. So let's move on to our next slide concerning natural resources. MICs compete for natural resources, mainly water and land. The search for water is a key threat to human survival. One water source includes building dams to divert the water from one source to another. For example, Turkey has diverted water from the Tigris-Euphrates river system in Western Asia. Hydroelectric dams also reduce the water supply running downstream. For instance, dam construction in China is ongoing and extensive. Water is used to make money from hydropower rather than to grow food for people. One of China's largest dams is running low in some areas because of limited rainfall and heavy pollution. Natural conditions are changing, and the dams are harmful to the environment. Many farmers have lost their land and are forced to move into the city. In addition, dam construction destroys villages, displaces families and communities, and again, forces people to move to the city. Another water source comes from underground drilling. This short-term process creates a food bubble and pulls water from deep in the earth to irrigate crops. But when the groundwater has depleted the aquifers, they cannot replenish. So in the long term, there is less food available, and the result is declining crop production because of limited water supplies. These short-term solutions that create food bubbles are not the answer to finding new sources of water. And in our next slide, we'll talk about land. MICs also compete for land. The threat from land deficits continues to plague nations worldwide. Wealthy nations, including Saudi Arabia and South Korea, as well as MICs, have limited land for growing food. Their solution is to lease or buy land in developing nations such as Ghana, Liberia, and Mozambique. For example, in Ethiopia, land can be leased for $1 a year, compared to land in Asia, leased at more than $100 a year. These land leases can run anywhere from 30 to 99 years. These land grabs to buy cheap land are common in wealthy countries and middle-income countries, including Brazil, China, India, Indonesia, and Mexico. But these land grabs are very popular. For example, over a 10-month period between 2008 and 2009, the World Bank identified 464 land acquisitions. 204 of these projects acquired 140 million acres. These were more acres of land than land used in the U.S. to plant wheat and corn. Over 218 billion square miles of land. So, in terms of numbers, 1 million acres equals 1,562.5 square miles. In terms of football fields, that is 3.8 billion football fields. I don't know what 308 billion football fields look like, but if you think about how much land that is on this planet, that's a ton of land that a lot of the wealthy nations are grabbing up from poor nations to grow food to feed people in the wealthy countries. Now, let's just move on to some of my findings on the next slide. Countries worldwide are experiencing conflicts around food policy. Natural resource limitations drive farmers and people out of their rural communities into the cities. The result creates an additional strain on urban communities and resources. Food conflicts can be environmental due to deficits in water and land resources. Conflicts can be social, creating starvation and diet-related diseases. These conflicts can also be economic, causing food insecurity. And more interestingly, these conflicts can overlap. For example, smallholder farms and neighbors can compete for their land and water resources. Also, weather extremes cause conflicts between smallholder farms and their neighbors and countries. Also, another conflict is when terrorists control food supplies after political unrest or a weather extreme, such as hurricanes, floods, etc. Another conflict is between river and marine fisheries. They struggle over the same scarce resources. Some solutions look at better distribution of access to food and distribution. By growing more food is not the solution. Perhaps access and better distribution of healthy, affordable food is the solution. So some projects look at combining high-producing crops with a better way to process the food to reduce waste. These involve some partnerships which sometimes can be conflicting interests, but if the bottom line is to get food to the people that really need it, the poor communities, this is also a potential solution. Next, starvation and obesity are not limited to low and high income countries. Middle income countries share the same problems, even as they improve their GDP and public infrastructures. Innovation and practical food policies are needed in MICs. These examples include infrastructures that provide food education programs to teach people the difference between healthy and unhealthy food. Another solution would be to provide resources for women farmers who can fill the gap and reduce hunger for 150 million people worldwide. These resources can include land, water, access to seeds, and opportunities to sell food and other ways to expand the food supply in their communities. In the next slide, I'll talk about my conclusions. First of all, the global food supply challenges include land and water deficits, when rich countries siphon resources from neighboring countries and beyond. People living downstream may likely struggle to survive, and civil war is possible. Next, MICs are the home for nearly 50% of the world's most impoverished people. Many people have diet-related diseases, are food insecure, and have limited access to healthy food. Sustainable food policies should include agricultural infrastructures. MICs need sustained investment from diverse partners to balance their economic growth with better food security. Cities may need public and private funding to develop urban agriculture projects to grow food in small spaces in the city. And finally, multiple stakeholders. Social equity and long-term solutions should include a role for women and smallholder farmers in food policy decision-making. And I want to draw your attention to this last picture on this slide. And speaking of women migrant farm workers are sexually abused as they work on farms all across the world. Many have no recourse because they have to work to support their families. They wear bandanas like this picture and other clothing to hide themselves as a way to prevent sexual abuse. The Bandana Project is an initiative to end sexual violence against women farm workers. This is just an example of some of the hidden side of the negative social outcomes from our global food policies. All right? Now, let's go to the next slide and talk about some potential solutions. First of all, sustainable agriculture provides alternative ways to conserve resources. One solution might be through water-saving practices, planting drought-resistant crops like olives, cucumbers, or beans. Also, building a pond to capture and store rainwater. There's also dry farming, where you can grow potatoes, apple trees, and wine grapes. Of course, organic farming, soil conservation, and crop rotation are other solutions. Another solution might be to save land. Zoning policies that conserve land for agriculture versus land for commercial investment or housing. Local ordinances that support urban agriculture or urban farming in the city can increase the number of urban gardens, rooftop farms, and freight farms. Also, brownfields are becoming more popular. Brownfields are on commercial or industrial land. A lot of cities are trying to clean up land to use it not just for commercial development, as I said, but also for agricultural use. Innovation in food production might include these brownfields, which have been overlooked for many years. Unfortunately, the problem with brownfields is that they are very expensive to clean before they can be used to grow food for agriculture. But as I said, brownfields provide a real resource for land expanding the food supply in many cities. Another solution is to look at food insecurity. That means greater access to fresh foods. Also trying to create a social safety net that includes food education so people can understand the difference between healthy and unhealthy foods. Also, food system infrastructures can provide a variety of healthy and culturally appropriate foods. Another solution is to diversify the food system. This includes public funding for women and smallholder farms to access resources to grow food. Also, lowering food waste at different points along the food supply chain. Some examples include turning out-of-date foods into jellies and jams, or using slightly damaged tomatoes for tomato juice or ketchup. Another solution is to support land rights for smallholder farms. Access to resources is another way to improve food diversity. That includes providing seeds, agricultural technologies, access to power and water, even roads for smallholder farms to transport their food. But one of the problems with smallholder farms is that there's a myth that they're not very productive. The challenge is that women provide 65% of agricultural labor worldwide. That means there are many farms, mainly in China and in India. These small farms should not be ignored because they are more productive than the larger farms. Productive as in more sustainable, they can grow a lot more variety of crops, as well as provide living for not only the farmers but the communities in which they live. One of the nice things about small farms as well is that people can stay in their communities, live in their rural communities, and they won't be forced out to live in the cities. So we should revisit this whole perspective of smallholder farms because I see in the future as more and more the population continues to grow, there will likely be more and more smallholder farms. And moving to the next slide, and now let's talk about some real-world sustainable agriculture. I wanted to show you this slide because I thought some of these examples were really interesting. The first one is about Bangladesh, floating gardens and food. And as we know, there's a lot of flooding in Bangladesh, where some of the farmers have used these conditions to grow crops. What they do is they grow their crops on top of water hyacinth and plant residue and algae. And I thought this was really interesting because farmers have provided an ongoing and sustainable way to grow food, using conditions that can generally be considered negative. Flooding is considered a bad thing, but clearly these people are using that as a resource to sustain themselves, to grow food, and to give back to their ecosystem. I thought that was really interesting. And the next example is of the Ayu of the Nagara River system in Japan. These are interlinked ecosystems, which include rivers, forests, and farmlands. And what happens in these communities, they're growing their whole livelihood around ayu, which is a type of fish in Japan. So they're using inland fisheries, they're trying to give back and sustain their communities through composting and recycling resources. What they've done is build a whole ecosystem around the river, the farmlands, and the forest. And I thought this was an excellent example of how people can survive if they creatively think about the resources in their communities, how to use them, how to survive, how to give back to the environment. I thought that was an excellent example. Also, I found an example of a farmer who had a problem with pests. So this person was growing sweet pepper. He had a sweet pepper crop. And so pests were starting to destroy his crop. So what he did was he built a small fence of another type of crop called hot cherry peppers. And what he found was that the hot cherry peppers deterred the pests, and he was very happy to use fewer pesticides to grow food. So I thought that's another creative way to try to think about sustainable agriculture. Another example is called no-till farming. We grow crops without destroying the soil. It's an organic practice that increases the amount of water in the soil and also retains the nutrients in the soil. And of course, another solution would be through crop rotation, another way to retain the nutrients in the soil. Grow different types of crop rather than just one type of a monocrop. All right. Now, let's move on to the last slide here. We talk about some food for thought. This overview of our current global food system highlights the connections between nature and our survival. These connections include food security and MICs, shrinking water and land resources, and strategies to feed our growing population. I leave you with these final thoughts. Public and private funding for alternative ways to grow agriculture may include trade-offs between different stakeholders. That means smallholder farms may be working with large agribusinesses to bring their crops to market. Sometimes it's a smart way for farmers to use infrastructures that are already in place, such as transportation, or better ways to preserve their food, or better ways to process their food so they can bring it to market. If the United Nations prediction for 9 billion people by 2015 is true, then we will need many different ways to grow food as soon as possible. You know, I was just curious about the world's population as it stands as of today, October the 8th. In the world, there are 7 billion people. And if you go through the list of the top 10 countries that are most populated in the world, 4 of the 5 middle-income countries are in the top 5 of that. For example, as I mentioned, China is number 1 at 1.4 billion people. India, 1.3 billion people. Indonesia has 258 billion people. And number 5 is Brazil, 206 billion people. Now, the United States is listed at number 3 at 324 billion people. But as I said, as you can see from some of these numbers, clearly, China, India, Indonesia, and Brazil, these middle-income countries will definitely be having challenges with more people, more problems with their infrastructure, more challenges to their food system. I just wanted to throw a few numbers out there like that. So I hope you'll think about how you can grow food for yourself, your family, and community. Alternatives can include community gardens, rooftop farms, fake farms, and even technology-based agriculture. Some of the simplest ways to grow food, of course, is through backyard gardens and backyard windowsill farms as well. So I leave you with one last question. How will we feed people in the future? Right? Thank you very much. And now I'll entertain any of your questions. Thank you.
Yeah, I have a question.
Yes.
What is the biggest challenge in improving our global food system?
That's a good question with no simple answers. I think some of the biggest challenges is that people don't understand the difference between good food and bad food. They tend to think that, cheap processed food is good for them, and they feel that they're filling themselves up with food. But in reality, this over-processed food is causing challenges in their health in terms of more diabetes in adults, obesity in young children. We see that around the world, and also with driving up healthcare costs. As a matter of fact, this year in China, they made a proclamation about what's called the China Plan, where they asked people to reduce meat consumption by 50%. Their goal is to reduce carbon emissions as well as obesity and diabetes. These issues are a growing problem for children and adults, and I think the government is really trying to figure out a way to lower their healthcare costs, because I see more and more stories about obese children. We're talking children under the age of preteens, children, not so much the teenagers. So they have camps to encourage children to eat better, to exercise more, and I can see that it's never been a problem before, but as economic growth continues in some of these countries, people want to eat the way that we in the West eat, and that's not a good way to go, because it increases their obesity and diabetes problems and drives up their healthcare costs. So I think one of the biggest challenges is just for people to be aware of the difference between good food and bad food, how to eat healthy, what it means to change their diets, and think about what they're putting in their mouths. Thank you for that question.
Well, I have another question, if you don't mind.
Sure.
Food policy is not on the agenda of presidential candidates. I was wondering why not.
Well, I would really have to say that food is sort of it's a very complex problem, okay? And politically, it's a challenge because if you're trying to make a change, it involves many, many stakeholders. For example, at the Republican and Democratic convention, a group is there, they were called Plate of the Union Truck, and what they were trying to do is talk to the politicians about what's your plan for a food policy? Well, they didn't get very far with that, because one of the biggest challenges in food in general is that there are many strong lobbyists. There's meat and cattle industry, there's sugar, there's corn, there's wheat, there's you name it. And so once you start deciding, well, maybe we should eat less meat, and of course, the cattle and meat lobby will start to scream and holler about that, and then that might affect politicians' funding, for example, and make them look like, oh, they're the bad guys. Because if you think back for a minute, it was several years ago, but Oprah said something about meat was bad, and that was a big deal. That was a big deal. So she got all this pushback from the cattle and meat industry. See? Now, again, one of the biggest problems with food is that it's very complex. And as I said, one of the simplest things is that I've seen more and more young children are starting to grow food in their schools. So some of the teachers are being more aware of some of the challenges of food in general. So they have little projects to kind of help kids, just grow simple things like start with herbs or grow potatoes or grow tomatoes in their classrooms so that they can see that they can grow food for themselves. And from there, hopefully they can take that home and educate their parents about, we can grow our own food. And Mom and Dad, let's try that for a while. And so hopefully from there, it can be a bottom-up effect. So the children will teach their parents, and the parents will go out and encourage their politicians to say, look, we need more urban gardens, urban farms, more community gardens in our community. What are you going to help about that? So I think it's a real educational process that has to start with individuals, with children, families, going out in the communities and demanding more awareness about food systems in general. But that's a good question, and a complex one as well. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. I appreciate your time. Have a good day. Thank you. Also, if you have more questions or you want to find out about my future presentations, you can find me on Twitter, Facebook, or LinkedIn at Bessie, PhD. All right, so feel free to reach out to me, contact me anytime, and I'll be in touch with you. Thank you again for your time. I appreciate it. Have a good weekend.